and welcome to this episode of Bring It On. My name's Bob Hayes, and I'm going to be your host for tonight's discussion. I am also the chairman of the Whitman-Hanson Regional School Committee and I have two members with me, Chris Scriven, who is a member from Whitman, he's the vice chair, and Chris Howard, who is a member from Hanson. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me this evening. The thought process of doing this show is to maybe answer some of the questions that Whitman-Hanson Regional School District put out a 10-page brochure to try and answer some of the questions that people have been asking and what happens with this and that. We're going to go over that. We're going to go over some of what's going on with the budget and why we think the override is important in a lot of questions. We only have a half hour, so we're going to do it as quickly as possible and try to get some of this information out there to the public, because it's very, very important for everyone to have all the information that we need. So thank you for joining me, and I want to thank our faithful camera guy, John Galvin, for doing this Zoom on a Friday night. It is what it is. So if anyone is looking for information to answer any questions about budgets or about numbers, as I said, the school has printed a 10-page document, and if you go to the Whitman-Hanson Regional School District site, which Mr. Galvin will put up for you later, it's WHRSD.org, you will find this sheet. But there are things, and you will have questions, so hopefully we can answer some of those. So we're going to jump right into it. When did the statutory method become available? And the answer to that is in 1993 under the Education Act of 1993. Second question was, how many regional school districts use the statutory methodology? According to the Mass Association of Regional Schools, the majority. Number three, are both methodologies legal to use? And the answer is yes, both methods are legal to use and both require majority vote at your town meetings in both towns. Whether it be Whitman or Hanson, you would have to have a majority vote. If we use the statutory method, does Hanson pay for Whitman students? Hanson and Whitman pay into a district budget. The money is divided to operate the school district. The minimum local contribution is subtracted from the foundation budget to determine Chapter 70. Chapter 70 is an amount of money that the state subsidizes a school with. And in Whitman-Hanson, I believe the figure is roughly $24 million. Do you guys concur with that?
Sounds about right, Bob.
I mean, I don't have the exact figure in front of me, and as we go down, we'll see that. Okay, could Hanson still use the agreement method of assessment? Yes, but if Whitman doesn't agree to the agreement method, we do not have a budget, and we must move to a 1/12 budget under the direction of the Department of Education and Secondary Education. He's known as the commissioner. Why don't we pay the same amount for education in Whitman and Hanson? We do pay the same amount per student. However, Department of Education and Secondary Education and the Department of Revenue have established the amount of money each town should pay for education. This was not anything that the towns came up with. As I just said, the Department of Education and Secondary Education, and everybody knows who the Department of Revenue is. They came up and established the amount of money that should be paid in. If a town doesn't pass a school budget, if the town does not pass the school budget, don't agree with the statutory method, does the assessment go back to the long-standing 60-year agreement method? This is a very important statistic. No. If we don't have an approved budget, the commissioner will establish a 1/12 budget using the statutory method. So having said that, if you go to this document on the Whitman-Hanson Regional School District page, you will find that it's 10 pages long. We're going to try to jump right into some of what's happened and how we got to where we are and where we think we're going with this. Let's talk about, we can go right into the override from Hanson. Chris Howard, can you explain that a little bit and how that affects the school district and how it affects the town with the up and coming override in Hanson?
Yeah, I will try as best I can, Bob. It's a fun topic and one that's a little complex, but basically the $800,000 override for the town of Hanson is being put forth, and this has been discussed by the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee. It's being put forth essentially to try and fund everything that's in the proposed budget for the town of Hanson, which does include the proposed budget that was approved by the school committee several weeks back. And so basically, what we talked about a little bit at the last school committee meeting was, if we look at the existing budget that was approved by the school committee, it would translate to an assessment to the town of Hanson of $11.75 million. That assessment includes the compromise amendment that's being put forth to both towns. And part of that funding, as you alluded to, Bob, would require an override for the town of Hanson. So without that, we wouldn't have an approved budget, and we'd likely go into the 1/12 budget scenario, which I'm sure we'll be talking about at some point this evening.
Okay, Chris, when you talk about an assessment to the towns, let's break it into a little bit easier terms, because the budget's $55 million. And if the town of Hanson is assessed at $11,500,000, how much is the town of Whitman assessed? And then people can see how much that the state puts up to get us to the $55 million.
Sure. So if we use the document that we referred to in school committee again a couple weeks back, that really has the proposed agreement broken out. And if you follow that through and you look at the totals there at the bottom, it basically gives you a total for Hanson for the $11,745 million, and for Whitman for about $16.2 million. So that totals, to your point, Bob, $27.95 million, which would be the total across both towns. So to your point, the remaining amount of that, roughly $27 million, would be coming from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Okay. Chris Scriven, when we talk about this and we talk about as we move through the document, there's another basic big part of this of per pupil expense. And as I understand it, the per pupil expense takes the total budget of the school district. We divide by the number of students and we come up with a figure. Now, I believe we have the ability to put a chart up that was also in this document that shows what the per pupil expense is in Hanson, Whitman Hanson, versus what it is in neighboring towns. And I think that people will see somewhat of a disparity in that, such as if you look, the per pupil expense in Whitman Hanson is $12,740 per student. Chapter 70 funding, which is the money from the state, is $24,552,030. Chapter 70 per pupil is $6,350. And the actual cost to the towns per pupil is $6,390. If you look in bordering communities, East Bridgewater is a little bit less than Whitman Hanson, and the rest are way more, going all the way down. If you look at Hull, it's $20,530. So if you look at the chart, there's quite a disparity in that. You guys see that? Are you looking at the same chart, Chris Scriven?
Yes, yep. Yeah, I think this chart really contextualizes, our predicament as a district when it comes to local funding. You see, we get a significant amount of state aid, and we lag behind in actual costs of town per pupil.
And if you look, there was 3,866 pupils in Whitman Hanson Regional School District. That is down quite a number compared to what it used to be years ago. So that also affects what your funding is going to be, correct?
Yes.
Okay. It's kind of mind-boggling to see what goes on. If you look at on the chart, we also had some class sizes. I don't think we've got the ability. I don't think you've got that. But John, how about the putting the chart up? It's the G chart, the 50-50 split. or the proposed method that we're going to try to get voted into the agreement. Chris, you want to go over that a little bit?
So,
Chris Howard?
yep.
Or
So
Chris-
so sure, we touched on this one a little bit, but basically, to dive a little bit deeper into how the amendment works, basically what we're doing, the simplest way to explain it is we're taking half of the old way and half of the new way. So we're basically using a 50% allocation of the current agreement methodology, the one that we've been using, and we're using a 50% methodology of the statutory method, which is the method that we're looking ultimately likely to move to. And again, that's something that's coming out of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
So under this 50-50 draft, the operating assessment to Hanson would be $11,883,415.54. And for Whitman, it would be $15,197,652 for a total of $27,081,067.54.
That includes the non-mandated busing. That's why it's higher. So if you subtract it out, you go to the operating underneath, because the non-mandated gets added back in later.
Yeah, okay, so if you take the adjusted operating at the 50-50, it's $11,214,176.79. And for Whitman, it's $15,367,391.75. That's the adjusted operating at a 50-50 original, and then a 60-40 split, which we were doing anyway. You agree with that, Chris? Both Chris's?
Yes.
Correct. That 60-40 split does show in the chart as to how that's being laid in both of the, because it does factor in both, right? The old agreement method essentially just used the straight 60-40 calculation if we were using this year's numbers. And then the statutory method does the application.
If you look at the totals and we include circuit breaker and E&D, we added $250,000 to this budget to take out of the budget from circuit breaker and $350,000 from E&D. E&D is excess and deficiency. The numbers are budgeted in the previous year, and then whatever monies aren't used, because we come in under budget, the money goes back in to a separate account. And then, as you can see, this is about the 5th year in a row we've used as much as when E&D had more money in it, we would use more than $850,000 at a couple different times to help balance the budget. But it's actually last year's money that was budgeted to put back into it because we came in under what the budget was predicted to be. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. So Chris Howard, let's put up the eye chart with the 1/12 budget. Thank you, John. Chris, you want to explain this a little bit?
Yeah, so this is what I was alluding to earlier, and for those folks that have followed our school committee meetings and listened to the superintendent speak on this, essentially, in simplistic summary terms, what happens here is the state essentially takes last year's budget, so in this case, we'd be looking at FY 2020, and applies basically a 1/12 factor. And so what happens is, and this is an important point for folks to understand, this is not a level services budget. This is simply using the same budget that we used the previous year. So as folks can appreciate, because we don't do this in our other town departments, because you're using that same number, it really results in significant cuts. So when you look at the number, that's where you do end up seeing those operating totals that differ significantly lower than what we just talked about at about 10.866 for Hanson and 13.42 million for Whitman. And then those totals at the bottom, because each town does have specific capital expenses and busing like we were just talking about, the total for Hanson ends up being about 11.4 million, and the total for Whitman, 14.2. The really, really important thing to note here is when we go to a 1/12 budget, the assessment methodology becomes statutory. So unlike what we were talking about in that other chart, where there's that 50-50 and we're using half the old and half the new, in this scenario, there is no old. We're simply using 100% of the statutory method. And that's why for the town of Hanson specifically, it's really not that big of a difference. You end up with an 11.4 assessment rather than that 11.75 million. It's really only a total of $350,000. However, there's significant cuts, and there's cuts that would actually impact the town likely, if, according to the data from Board of Selectmen and FinCom in Hanson.
Speaking of Board of Selectmen and FinCom, as you probably saw, that there's people that are all over the place with how this is going. There's been letters to the editor. There's been FinCom committees in both towns coming out with different discussions, and it's been rather a lively debate. And a lot of people have obviously rung in, and they're very concerned about how this is going to go. If the override fails, Chris Howard, what does that mean to the town of Hanson?
Right. So again, hopefully we're not throwing too many numbers at the folks watching, but basically, if the override doesn't pass and the school budget does not pass as approved, which would mean the compromise would also be taken off the table, so to speak, because that's contingent upon the budget being passed, Hanson would end up with an assessment of this 11.4 that we were just looking at. So what that means, again, just kind of listening to the numbers from the various meetings that have been presented out of Hanson, what that means is if we don't have the $800,000 override, the school budget would be that 11.4112. That's likely going to be the lowest number that comes out of the schools. And unfortunately, that means the town of Hanson is now short still $450,000, not talking about the schools, right? So in that case, you know, I can't speak to what would happen specifically, but I can tell you if the town is short $450,000, that's going to be a significant issue that likely would result in some sort of cuts to some sort of services. And again, this is outside the schools. So that really becomes a problem. And that's what folks need to understand in terms of what they decide to do with the override. If they decide not to support the override, that's certainly their right. However, we will end up in a situation where likely there will be significant cuts both to the regional school district, and there will likely be some sort of issue with the town budgets as well.
Okay, on the Whitman side, the 50-50 split has a caveat, so to speak, coming from Whitman of what's the total sum. If both towns agree to the 50-50 split for this year and this year only, that's what this agreement that they're going to be voting on, whether to support it or not to support it. If they agree to it, then next year it goes completely to statutory.
That's correct.
You want to speak to that, Chris Scriven?
Yeah, well, there's, as everybody knows, there's been ongoing discussions from town elected officials going back for, I guess, started back last summer. And the intention was always to try to come up with some type of compromise, knowing that the economic impact on Hanson would be pretty significant. So, you know, this is basically, it's essentially exactly what a compromise is, where neither party is 100% satisfied. But, you know, I guess this moves us forward. And, you know, if the override in Hanson passes and the amendments in the budget pass, you know, we feel like we're doing what we can to properly educate children is what it comes down to.
Okay. Chris, do you see any difference? You see it that way? Anything to add to that statement?
I think Chris Scriven said it well. Again, I think the most important thing that folks need to understand is this is a path to move us forward. So it's very easy to try and poke holes and say, I don't like this or I don't like that. But I would encourage folks to listen as to what follows that sentence. And if it's nothing, that's not moving us forward. So to Chris's point, while again, on the Hanson side specifically, after this year, based upon that agreement, we would move to the statutory method. I would remind folks that if we don't have a budget and we go to a 1/12 budget, we'll be moving to the statutory methodology this year. So again, I think it's important to really think about how do we move forward as a district. And in the case of Hanson, it's really how we move forward as a town, because the part that folks are not talking about is, again, not only the issues with the schools, but if there is not sufficient funding for the town, there will be service impacts to the town of Hanson. So I really view this as more of the something, the override itself is really a way to support the town of Hanson, not necessarily just the schools.
Chris, can I just jump in here?
Certainly.
I know we don't want to hypothesize on what those cuts would be, but when you reference services, just so people understand what we're talking about, what types of services do you think are could possibly be affected in Hanson?
Yeah, I don't know. So Chris, I can't answer that. I mean, that is definitely a question that would be something to ask the Finance Committee and Board of Selectmen. But I can tell you that, again, I'm just doing the math with the numbers they provided, $450,000 shortfall to the town of Hanson. This has nothing to do with the school system. That's a significant number. So I don't know what the cuts would be, but certainly there's going to be cuts.
Right. Yeah, I guess I just was trying to contextualize the issue for the voters. When you talk about town services, you know, I guess it includes everything from recreational, the recreation department to, you know, police, fire, things like that. So just to give people an idea what we're talking about when we say services.
Well, it's been proposed from different people that this $800,000 override is strictly a school override. 5 left is strictly a school override. And from what you're telling me and what we're seeing, if it doesn't pass, it's not a school override only, it's a services override for other departments to keep everybody in the same services that they're in now, Chris. Is that sort of the way you see it?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Bob. Again, I can only go by the numbers that have been made public. So, and I just heard it at the Finance Committee meeting from this past week. I think it was on the, don't quote me on this, it was today's the 19th, it was a few days ago. And they were clear. They said, look, right now we're short $865,000. I think the plan was they could find the 65, but they need 800. So if the override does not pass, again, I'm just doing some simple math. I'm trying to figure out how we go lower than 1/12, and I don't see a way to do that. And so if the schools are at 1/12, again, there's still $450,000 short that would be coming from the town. So in my opinion, just using that math, again, I don't know the legalese behind it, but I would actually suggest that the override is probably more for the town of Hanson than it is for the schools.
Okay. Now, just to be clear on the 1/12, Whitman Hanson Regional High School is in the same boat as a lot of schools. I mean, Whitman Hanson Regional School District, I said high school, I got wrapped up in that. The Whitman Hanson Regional School District is in the same boat as a lot of schools in the Commonwealth for the simple reason of they're reliant on state aid, and the state has not come up with a budget yet. Usually by now, the state has come up with a budget. Because of COVID-19, the state has not formulated a budget yet. And as far as answering some of the questions that have been asked, I know that people are abuzz around town. COVID-19 also is presenting a problem. If as regulated to the schools right now, it could be somewhere between an additional $1.5 to $2 million extra cost to bring the children back to schools in September. That's something that's totally different, you know, and it's not relevant. This is the first step we have to get through, correct?
Correct. If I could add on to that, Bob?
Sure.
I think it's important clarification for people to understand that while we will start off this school year in 1/12 because of COVID, that's a different scenario than if we don't pass a budget within the communities, right? So if we start off in a 1/12 because of COVID, as soon as we the process will be that we'll come out of it, I think maybe in August. Is that correct, Chris?
Yeah, I think your point is well stated, right? So we do need an approved budget by both towns, or we would stay in that 1/12. So starting in 1/12, to your point, and then getting an approved budget through both town meetings is likely the path forward. Without that, we're going to have an issue because we would stay in that 1/12 scenario.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, it's hard to believe, but our director here has informed me that we only have about a minute and a half left. And it was a quick half hour. We're hoping, ladies and gentlemen, that by seeing this show, and maybe we can provide you with another, I will be looking for questions. If you need to contact me or you have any questions that you would like to ask, because this is a lot of stuff to take in. And if you read the document, it's very lengthy. My email address is Bob Hayes, all small letters, 4433@gmail.com. My phone number is 617-538-0189. If you need to call, or you have any questions that you would like answered, or you have any thoughts on this subject, please don't hesitate to call, because this is going to shape the future of how Whitman-Hanson Regional School District moves forward. It's also got some serious financial ramifications to both towns of Whitman and Hanson. The Whitman-Hanson Regional School District has always been supported very well, and we hope to continue down that path. We will work through this. This has been a very trying year for everyone, as we know. So we hope that this was informative. We hope that you enjoyed it. And again, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to contact us or contact the superintendent's office. He will be more than happy to answer any questions that you have. You can call the superintendent's office anytime during business hours, which is 8 to 4, and he will answer any questions that he can for you. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Bring It On.